No one in Everly Hollow dared speak the names of the twin girls out loud after sundown. They had once been beautiful, identical as mirrored reflections, with hair like black silk and eyes as clear as polished obsidian. But the beauty was only a facade, thin and fragile as the frost that clung to the window panes in winter. Beneath it lived something far older and darker than childhood. It began, they say, on the night the Everly sisters were born. The midwife, seasoned and weather-worn, had delivered many children in the Carolina countryside. But when she beheld the newborns, her blood ran cold. Clara came first, silent, unmoving. Lucille followed moments later, howling into the storm-torn night, fists clenched and face red with fury. But when the midwife touched Clara to swaddle her, Lucille screamed louder as if scorched by the contact. The midwife paused, confused. She pinched Clara's tiny foot. Lucille shrieked again. The girls were separated at birth, not conjoined in body, but connected by pain. When Clara bled, Lucille screamed. When Lucille broke a bone, Clara wept. Doctors were summoned. The phenomenon puzzled even the most learned minds. Theories ranged from nerve entanglement in the womb to some new form of psychological bond, but the medical community eventually gave up, unable to explain what their instruments could not measure. Only one man offered something close to understanding. Dr. Milton Harrow, a fringe neurologist turned spiritualist, visited Everly Hollow in 1898. He examined the girls, then 8 years old, pale and wide-eyed. He watched as Lucille stubbed her toe and Clara gasped. He smiled grimly. "This," he muttered, "is not science. This is memory. This is blood." He left the next day without a word, taking his notebooks with him. The Everly sisters were left behind, condemned to endure pain twice over for every injury, one in the body, the other in the soul. The townsfolk whispered. Some said the girls were cursed, the product of a pact made generations ago. Others claimed their mother, Ophelia Everly, had toyed with forces no human should summon. After all, the Everlys had long lived at the edge of town, in a decaying mansion older than most cemeteries, surrounded by trees that never lost their leaves and shadows that never shifted. And through it all, Clara and Lucille grew, bound not just by blood, but by agony. Yet for every shiver of horror, there was an undeniable fascination. The kind that kept people glancing over their shoulders or lingering a little too long near the iron gate of the Everly estate. The kind that makes you press play even though you know you shouldn't. You're here now, aren't you? So before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel. These stories dive deeper with every minute, and you won't want to miss what's waiting in the dark. Now back to the sisters. The bond between Clara and Lucille was more than strange. It was unnatural. No matter how far apart they were, one would feel the other's pain. It wasn't mimicry. It wasn't empathy. It was something deeper, older, bone-deep and absolute. On the coldest nights, the sound of a scream could be heard from the Everly mansion, sharp, sudden, echoing down the hills. Sometimes no one was hurt at all. Sometimes it was only a dream one of them had. But the pain was real, and while the town whispered and the trees stood still, something inside that house, something buried beneath years of silence and dust, was beginning to stir. The Everly sisters were about to uncover a secret that would not only explain their suffering, but bind their fates to a darkness no scream could undo. Everly Hollow was a place lost in time. Tucked between thick forests and muddy riverbeds, the town seemed forgotten by progress, its roads cracked and winding, its buildings leaning like old men too stubborn to fall. People lived simple lives, farmers, preachers, widows, and always above them on the hill loomed the Everly estate. The house was a thing of sorrow. Built in 1841 by Eliab Everly, it had been grand once. 3 stories of hand-carved wood, wrought iron balconies and a sweeping front porch lined with columns. Now it was rotting. Ivy strangled the walls. Paint peeled in great patches. Windows stared out like blind eyes. No one ever saw workers there. No one ever saw visitors, only the Everly girls. Clara and Lucille grew up behind those decaying walls like flowers under glass, watched, protected, and never quite free. Their mother, Ophelia, was a tall woman with long grey hair and eyes that seemed to watch too much. She rarely left the house, but when she did, the townspeople would go silent, lowering their gazes until she passed. She spoke in riddles and rules. "Never mirror your sister's pain aloud," she'd whisper. "The echo will draw the wrong ears." Or, "If one weeps, let the other smile. Balance keeps the gates shut." The twins obeyed. They always obeyed. Ophelia homeschooled them, teaching arithmetic, literature, Latin. But there were other lessons too: how to keep salt at the corners of their beds, how to wash their hands with rosemary water at dusk, how to mark their skin with chalk symbols when they were afraid. They didn't ask why. The mansion was vast and filled with strange rooms. Some were locked. Some simply felt locked, their doorknobs too cold, the air behind them too thick. Clara once tried to open the red door at the end of the eastern hallway. It wouldn't budge. Later that night, Lucille woke screaming, her shoulder burning as though seared. The bond between them deepened in those years. At first it was only pain. A stubbed toe, a bee sting, a scraped knee. They would feel it twice. Then came the stranger moments. One day Clara bit her tongue by accident. Lucille began choking, though nothing was in her mouth. Another time, Lucille dreamed she was drowning. Clara woke with her lungs aching and her sheets soaked. They told no one, not even Ophelia. By the time they were 10, Clara and Lucille barely needed words. They could feel each other's thoughts like gentle pressure against glass. Sometimes they would laugh at the same moment without knowing why. Sometimes they would cry. But outside their crumbling world, the town watched. Children whispered about the ghost twins. Adults crossed themselves as they passed the base of the hill. The grocer once caught Clara staring too long at a jar of honey. That night every bee in his shed died. The Everleigh name had long carried weight in Everleigh Hollow, but now it carried fear. One day, a boy from town, Eli Mercer, dared his friends to run up the hill and touch the Everleigh gate. He reached it, grinning. Before his hand could make contact, he tripped, hitting his head on a stone. Blood poured from his scalp. That same moment, Lucille collapsed in the Everleigh kitchen, screaming, her forehead split open. She bore the same scar Eli would carry for life. The story spread fast, and parents began forbidding their children to speak of the twins. Yet the stories kept growing, fed by every shiver and every scream carried by the wind. The Everleigh sisters remained cloistered, raised by silence, shadow, and the cold wisdom of their mother. And inside them, something was changing. The pain they shared was no longer just physical. It had started to echo deeper, past the flesh, into memory and dream. Neither girl dared speak of it aloud. But at night, when the trees creaked and the walls moaned with age, they would look into each other's eyes and know that something ancient stirred between them, waiting, watching. The first real test of their bond came on a rain-slick afternoon in autumn, when the leaves were turning brittle and the world outside the Everleigh house smelled of smoke and soil. Clara had been reading on the landing of the grand staircase, legs curled under her, the book limp in her hands. Lucille was upstairs in the music room, playing scales on the out-of-tune piano, lost in thought. No warning, no sound. Only a crack, a sudden hollow snap of bone. Clara's slipper caught on a loose board. Her foot twisted and she tumbled, her body folding awkwardly against the wooden stairs. Her wrist bent the wrong way beneath her, her shoulder slammed into the banister, and her head struck the post at the bottom. The silence that followed lasted less than a second. From above came a scream so raw, so primal, it tore through the house like a blade. Lucille's voice, shrill and animalistic, echoed off the walls. She hadn't seen the fall, she hadn't heard the impact, but she felt it, every bone, every bruise, every inch of pain. Her body collapsed onto the piano keys with a discordant crash. Ophelia came running, her dress trailing behind her like smoke. She reached Clara first, blood trickling from her temple, wrist bent, breathing shallow. But before she could lift her, another cry rang out. Lucille again, trembling, eyes wide with fear, her own wrist swelling, though she hadn't fallen at all. The doctor arrived hours later, an aging man with hands that trembled slightly as he unpacked his satchel. Charles Merrow had served the town for decades, and he had treated the Everleigh girls before, though always at Ophelia's request and never without payment in gold coin. He examined Clara. Fractured wrist, bruised ribs, minor concussion. Then he turned to Lucille. The swelling, the discoloration. It mirrored Clara's injuries too closely. But there were no signs of trauma, no abrasions or bruising on the skin that shouldn't be there. Sympathy pain, he murmured. Psychosomatic. His eyes didn't meet Ophelia's. You don't believe that, she said coldly. Dr. Merrow hesitated. No, he admitted. I don't. He left before nightfall, leaving behind more questions than answers. That night, Lucille sat by Clara's bedside, silent. Her hand rested gently over her sister's bandaged wrist. Neither spoke of what had happened. They didn't have to. For days afterward, the house remained quiet, as if holding its breath. The walls creaked less. The wind dared not rattle the windows. Even the fire in the hearth burned lower, as if mourning. But outside, Everleigh Hollow stirred. News travelled fast, even when spoken in hushed tones. Rumours swelled and slithered from mouth to mouth. Someone had seen the doctor's carriage leave the Everleigh estate in a rush. Someone else claimed they heard two screams at once from the hill, one of pain, the other not entirely human. At the general store, a woman whispered that the twins were marked, bound by something older than blood. At church, a man murmured that their cries had shaken his window panes. Ophelia forbade the girls from leaving the house for a week. She sealed the front doors and drew chalk symbols on the windowsills. She began burning sage in the corners of their rooms and reciting old Latin verses Clara recognized from a forgotten book. You were never meant to be split, she muttered once, thinking no one heard. The pain is the reminder. The girls said nothing, but in the days that followed, Clara noticed something in Lucille's eyes, a shadow of fear that hadn't been there before. It wasn't the pain that haunted her, it was the helplessness. The knowledge that no matter where she was, what she did, her sister's agony would always be her own. And far beyond the gate, in the woods where the trees stood ancient and still, something listened. It had heard the scream. It remembered. The winter after Clara's fall brought more than frost to the Everleigh estate. Snow blanketed the hill in silence, muting even the whispers that used to float from the forest. Inside the mansion, Clara recovered slowly, her arm now stiff, her steps more cautious. But it was Lucille who changed most. She had grown quiet, not with sadness, but with watchfulness, as though waiting for something to return. One afternoon, while Ophelia slept and Clara dozed by the hearth, Lucille wandered deeper into the house than she'd ever dared. The west wing had long been off limits. Its halls sagged with age, its walls lined with paintings turned to face the plaster. No one went there anymore, not even the servants who had long since vanished without explanation. The air in that corridor felt colder, though no windows stood open. Dust clung to the floor in thick carpets, undisturbed. At the very end of the hallway, behind a warped door with a rusted keyhole, Lucille found a room she'd never seen. It was circular, windowless and empty, except for a single tall object in the center, shrouded in a faded linen sheet. Something in her chest tightened. Her feet moved before her thoughts did. She pulled the cloth free. A mirror stood before her, ornate, heavy, almost black with tarnish. Its frame was carved with winding vines and strange symbols she didn't recognize, but that stirred a shiver in her spine. The glass was fogged with age, but even so, her reflection looked clearer than it should have, sharper, too present. Lucille stared at herself for a moment, then frowned. There were two reflections in the mirror. She turned. No one behind her. She looked again. Only one now. The other had vanished like breath on glass. She backed away. That night, she told Clara. They returned to the room together, but the mirror stood silent, still, unyielding. No second reflection appeared. No tricks. No sounds. But the cold lingered longer in that room than anywhere else in the house. Hidden behind a loose stone in the hearth, Lucille found something else. A book, wrapped in brittle cloth, edges blackened with what looked like soot. A name was etched into the cover in faded gold. Iphigenia Everleigh, their grandmother. The diary was a patchwork of ink and madness. Some entries were poems, others confessions, still others diagrams and lists. Much of it was unreadable, words crossed out, sentences ending mid-thought. But the tone was unmistakable. Desperation threaded through every page. "I was told the bond would skip a generation," one entry read. "But they came anyway, twins, whole and not, split and not. I cannot undo what was done." "Only contain it." Another entry chilled them both. "If one is cut, the other will bleed. If one is taken, the other will follow. They are two vessels, one heart. Should they ever stand before the mirror together, the lock will shift." Clara closed the book with trembling hands. Neither spoke of it again, but from that night on they avoided the West Wing. The diary, however, remained under Clara's pillow. She read it in secret, tracing the faded ink with fingertips that shook. Lucille, meanwhile, found herself drawn to the mirror again and again, though she never returned to the room. She would dream of it, tall, cold, humming softly, a second version of herself, watching from within. Sometimes the dream Lucille moved differently, smiled at the wrong moments, tilted her head when she should have nodded. She never told Clara, but in the days that followed, she noticed other things. Shadows seemed to stretch longer near the hearth. The wind made music through the cracks in the walls. Once she caught her reflection in the parlor mirror smiling before she did. The mirror had seen something. And somewhere deep inside, Lucille began to feel it watching still. The attic had always been forbidden. Ophelia warned them from the time they could understand language. "What's locked above," she said, "must remain so. Some rooms remember more than they should." It was enough to keep them away until now Clara couldn't sleep. The diary's words had lodged themselves like splinters in her mind, and Lucille's silence had grown heavier, too pointed to ignore. One evening, just past twilight, Clara followed a tug in her chest that she didn't quite understand, up the narrow staircase at the back of the library, the one cloaked in cobwebs and dust. At the top, behind a warped wooden door, she found the attic. It smelled of cedar, wax, and something older, something dry and sweet, like withered flowers sealed in books. The floor groaned beneath her feet as she stepped inside. Faded trunks lined the walls, stacked haphazardly beside furniture draped in yellowed sheets. But in the far corner, tucked beneath the sloped ceiling, stood a table. It was not like the rest, clean, untouched. An altar, small and precise, carved from dark wood. Symbols scorched its surface, some matching those from the diary. Atop it lay a bundle of dried lavender, a rusted key, and a photograph. Clara picked it up. The image was black and white, grainy and stiff with age. Two girls, twins, stood beside each other, solemn and unmoving. They looked just like Clara and Lucille, too much like them. But the photo was dated 1821. Beneath the image, a single word had been scrawled in ink. "The offering." Clara's heart thudded. She tucked the photo into her sleeve and turned to leave. But something caught her eye. Behind a broken wardrobe, a small wooden chest sat wedged into the corner. Inside were more items, small bones, a doll with pins stuck into its cloth skin, and a circle of hair bound with red thread. She didn't take anything else. She couldn't. That night, Clara told Lucille, the sisters sat together in the dark, the photo laid flat between them. The resemblance was undeniable. Clara traced the edges of the picture, while Lucille stared at the twins' eyes, wide and shadowed. "Do you think they're us?" Lucille asked softly. "I don't know," Clara said, "but I think they were like us." They returned to the attic together 2 days later. This time Lucille saw the altar. She knelt before it without being told, fingertips brushing the carvings as though they might respond. Clara stood beside her, breath shallow. A gust of wind pushed through the cracked ceiling board above, and the candle stub on the altar flickered to life. Neither had lit it. They stared as the flame danced, casting long shadows across the floor. Lucille reached for the rusted key, holding it like a relic. Behind them the door groaned shut. They ran. After that, neither sister entered the attic again. But the photograph remained hidden under Clara's mattress, and the key found its place in Lucille's locket. The air in the house grew heavier. At night, the boards overhead creaked as if someone paced slowly in the dark. Clara began waking with faint bruises that had no explanation. Lucille's dreams grew louder, not stranger, just more insistent. Voices whispering names, numbers, dates. One morning, she woke with the word offering scratched faintly into the frost on her window pane, from the inside. They began to wonder if Ophelia knew more than she had ever said, but when they asked, she only answered with silence. The diary grew thinner with use. Its final pages mentioned a ceremony interrupted, a pair of twins lost to the woods, a bond too strong to sever without consequence. The attic had remembered, and now, it seemed, the house itself was beginning to recall what had once been forgotten. The storm came without warning. By dusk, the sky had turned the color of iron, and wind howled through the branches like mourning voices. Rain followed heavy and fast, flooding the hills' worn paths and making rivers of the dirt roads below. Thunder cracked open the night, and the old house groaned under every gust, as though remembering too much all at once. Clara had gone to fetch firewood from the parlor when she slipped on the wet stone of the hearth. Her shoulder struck the edge of the woodpile. There was a loud snap. Her scream never came, because Lucille screamed for her. She was upstairs brushing her hair before bed when her knees gave out. The brush clattered to the floor as she clutched her own shoulder, gasping. A fiery, invisible spike pierced through her collarbone, and her throat tore open with a cry so violent it echoed down the stairwell and into the storm. Ophelia was in the kitchen. She dropped the kettle and ran. By the time she reached Clara, the girl lay curled on the rug, teeth clenched, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Her right arm hung limp. Bone jutted beneath the skin, misaligned and wrong. Lucille stumbled down the stairs seconds later, drenched in sweat, her own shoulder reddening beneath her nightgown as if bruised by a force that hadn't touched her. The sound of Lucille's scream had not been contained by walls. It had travelled, out the windows, down the hill, across the crooked fences of Everley Hollow. It had reached the church steeple, where Pastor Doyle paused mid-prayer. It had shaken the shutters of the general store and made dogs howl in their yards. People heard it, and they remembered. By morning, the town was whispering again. Not in curiosity now, but in fear. Eloise Brant, the baker's wife, claimed she felt the sound in her chest. "Like something old brushing past me," she said. The widow Hargreaves insisted the scream shattered the glass of her oil lamp, though no one else could find the shards. A child at the schoolhouse refused to speak all day. When pressed, she said, "The black-eyed girl screamed inside my ears." The town hadn't spoken so openly about the Everleys in years, but now fear loosened tongues. Old superstitions surfaced, talk of witches, of spirits bound in flesh, of bloodlines cursed long before the girls were born. Reverend Doyle, rattled and shaking, gathered his parishioners that same evening. They knelt in the pews and prayed against the works of darkness. Some claimed to see shadows outside the stained glass windows, standing still in the lightning. Clara's injury healed slowly. Her shoulder was set, her arm bound tight, but the pain lingered far longer than expected. Lucille flinched with every movement Clara made. Even lifting a cup became an ordeal. They began to move in tandem, careful, quiet, afraid of hurting one another by mistake. Ophelia said little, but late one night Lucille heard her weeping through the walls, not mourning, but fear. And then the Reverend vanished. 3 days after the prayer circle, he left home before dawn and never returned. His hat was found beside the fence near the Everley gate, soaked with dew. His Bible was open on the front pew, but no one saw him again. The town grew colder, tighter. Doors locked earlier. Curtains were drawn before sunset. The road leading to the hill became empty, even during the day. The scream had been more than a sound. It was a signal. Clara and Lucille knew something had shifted. The house felt heavier. The air seemed to cling to their skin. And sometimes, in the silence between thunderclaps, Clara swore she could hear whispers in the walls, low, rhythmic, like the turning of pages in a book she'd never read but always known. Whatever had once waited was waking. It began with a knock on the gate. Just after dusk, As the last sliver of sunlight sank behind the hills, a dull, rhythmic pounding echoed up the long gravel path that led to the Everley estate. Ophelia stood at the second-floor window, watching the shapes gather below. Lanterns flickered in trembling hands. A dozen people, maybe more, faces masked by shadow and fury. They held pitchforks, torches, wooden crosses bound in twine. She said nothing. Clara and Lucille had felt it hours before. A hum beneath the floorboards, a pressure in the chest. The moment the Reverend disappeared, something inside the town had snapped. Now, fear had turned to action, and action always needed a target. The gate groaned open. No one had touched it. The townspeople hesitated. Then one man stepped forward. Gerald Pike, the blacksmith, broad-shouldered and sweating. He was the first to speak. "This house isn't right." The others murmured agreement. A woman lifted her rosary. Someone held a Bible upside down. "We come for the girls." Ophelia descended the stairs in silence, gathered her daughters behind her, and opened the front door. The wind surged in, carrying the scent of fire and wet grass. The crowd stood just beyond the porch, unsure, like animals sensing a trap, but too frenzied to retreat. Lucille gripped Clara's hand tightly. Neither of them blinked. "You come with torches and think yourselves holy," Ophelia said, her voice low, measured. "You have no idea what holiness is." "You hide demons in your house," Pike spat. "We've heard the screams. We know what's in your blood." Ophelia stepped forward. "You don't know what's in yours." The first torch flew before she finished speaking. It hit the side of the porch, flames licking the rotted wood. The second torch followed, landing in the dry garden bed. Soon the bushes were ablaze, casting flickering light against the white pillars of the Everley house. And then came the cross. Bound in oil-soaked cloth, it was set aflame and planted firmly at the base of the hill. Its silhouette burned against the darkness, a crooked X of fear and fury. The crowd chanted prayers, some garbled, others invented in panic. Children clung to their mothers. The air stank of smoke and old superstition. Inside, Clara's breath came shallow. The heat pressed against the windows. Sparks danced along the eaves. Lucille cried without tears, her grip cutting into Clara's palm. Ophelia turned back to them. "There's a place under the house," she said. "Old stairs behind the cellar door. Go now. Do not wait for me." They didn't move. "Now." The walls creaked. Glass shattered in the parlor. A burning branch crashed through the rear window. Ophelia vanished into smoke as Clara and Lucille ran. The cellar was colder than expected, thick with damp stone and forgotten things. They found the hidden door behind stacked crates. It opened with a hiss. Below, earth and roots, a passage of mud and bone. They followed it until the smoke above dimmed and the world narrowed to the sound of dripping water. The house burned. The roof collapsed. Walls fell inward. Still, the cross at the base of the hill kept burning long after the torches died. By morning, the crowd had scattered. Guilt does not linger well in daylight. Only two shapes emerged from the forest. The girls were silent, covered in soot, eyes wide, breathing thin. They watched their home smolder from a distance. Ophelia was never seen again. Some believed she'd perished in the fire. Others whispered she'd vanished into the smoke, claimed by whatever she'd once bargained with. But the Everley sisters survived. And from that moment, something inside them changed. Not just fear, not just pain. Clara felt it first. An echo not from Lucille, but from beneath her skin. Lucille, too, began to hear voices in the silence, not in words but in pulls, like tides moving against her soul. The fire had not destroyed the secret, it had only woken it. The forest took them in. For days after the fire, Clara and Lucille wandered among the moss-covered trees, surviving on rainwater and berries, hiding from the world that had tried to erase them. They slept curled together beneath roots and listened to the earth breathe. The bond between them pulsed stronger now, more than sensation, more than pain. It was presence. They no longer needed words, they barely needed thought. On the fourth morning, they woke to find a man watching them. He stood at the edge of a clearing, hands empty, posture still. His coat was dark, worn at the sleeves, and his eyes held no fear, only recognition. "You have her eyes," he said softly. "Ophelia's. And her mother's before that." Clara rose first. "Who are you?" "Elias Crane," he said. "I've been searching for you." Lucille narrowed her eyes. Why? "Because you're the last ones," he replied, "and the cycle is nearly closed." They didn't follow him right away. But hunger makes strange allies. He offered bread, water, and silence. It was enough. Elias led them deep into the woods, farther than they thought the trees reached. There, hidden in a grove surrounded by standing stones, stood a cabin, small, crooked, older than memory. Inside, the air smelled of sage and ink. Books lined every surface. Symbols marked the walls. It felt like stepping into a memory. Elias explained slowly over hours, then days. "Iphigenia Everly was not the first," he began, "nor the last. Every third generation, twins are born into the Everly bloodline, identical in body, but not in spirit. One anchored to flesh, the other to something older." He showed them a journal, bound in cracked leather. Inside were drawings, ritual circles, blood charts, mirrored faces. At the center of every page, two girls, joined by a cord of light. "The bond you carry was meant to be completed," he said. "In 1821 it was attempted, the offering. But the ritual was stopped before it finished. The power fractured, some escaped, some lingered." Clara's voice was quiet. "Why us?" "Because you were born at the right time, with the right blood, and because Ophelia refused to finish what Iphigenia started." Lucille leaned forward. "Finish it how?" Elias hesitated. Then, slowly, he laid a knife on the table. It was curved, old, the metal black with age. Along the blade, the same markings etched into the attic altar. "To sever the bond," he said, "one vessel must be broken, fully, permanently. The pain must pass entirely into the other. Only then can the loop be closed." They stared at the blade. "You mean one of us has to die?" Clara whispered. "No," Elias replied. "One of you has to remain." Lucille stood. Her voice was ice. "You brought us here to kill each other." "I brought you here to choose," he said calmly, "because if you don't, something else will choose for you." He didn't press them further. He only gave them the journal, the blade, and a final warning. "You're not the first to run," he said, "but none who ran ever made it far. The bond doesn't weaken, it grows. And eventually it consumes." That night the sisters lay awake beside the fire. Clara traced the hilt of the blade with trembling fingers. Lucille stared into the smoke until her eyes burned. They didn't speak. But in the silence, both remembered the photograph in the attic. The twins with their solemn eyes, the word offering scrawled beneath. The stranger had not lied. The truth had waited for them long before the fire, long before the scream. And now it stood between them, steel and shadow, asking for a decision neither of them wanted to make. The blade stayed between them for 3 days. Neither sister moved it, neither spoke of it. But its presence filled the air like smoke, suffocating, inescapable. They ate in silence, slept fitfully. Lucille wandered the woods during the day, returning with twigs in her hair and dirt beneath her nails. Clara reread the journal until the ink blurred, searching for some page, some line, that might offer another path. But there was only ever one. On the 4th night, Clara spoke first. "It should be me." Lucille didn't look up. "Why?" "I'm the weaker one. You've always protected me. Even when you were in pain. That doesn't mean I'm stronger. It means you'd survive it." Lucille turned. "You think that's surviving? Living with all of it? Alone?" Clara hesitated. "It's better than both of us dying." Lucille shook her head. "That's not a choice. That's surrender." They sat across from each other, the knife between them on the wooden floor. It didn't gleam. It absorbed light. A void wrapped in metal. "We don't even know if it would work," Lucille whispered. "We do," Clara replied. "You felt every cut I've taken, every bruise, every break. If I go first, you'll feel it. You'll carry it, and I won't." Lucille's eyes shone with something brittle and breaking. "You think that's mercy?" I think it's love. Silence again, the kind that presses against the skin. I don't want to live without you, Lucille said. You won't, Clara replied. I'll still be there, in the bond, in the pain, maybe even more than before. Lucille stared into the fire. It cracked softly, as if listening. Then she stood. I won't let you, she said. She grabbed the knife and raised it high toward herself. Clara lunged. The blade clattered to the ground. They wrestled, not in anger but in desperation. Two halves of one broken soul, fighting not to destroy but to sacrifice. Hands trembled, tears blurred vision, their breaths came in gasps. Clara pinned Lucille down. Stop, she sobbed. Please, stop. You're not going to die for me, Lucille hissed, and I won't watch you do it either. They lay there, tangled and shaking. The knife beside them, cold and patient. Hours passed. Neither moved. At dawn, Elias returned. He found them curled on the floor, back to back, the blade untouched. He said nothing, only stirred the coals and poured tea. You think we're cowards, Clara said. No, Elias answered. You're sisters. Lucille lifted her head. There has to be another way. There always is, Elias said. But it always demands something more. He didn't elaborate. That evening, Clara sat alone in the clearing, eyes closed, listening to the wind through the trees. She felt Lucille's heartbeat in her chest. Not metaphorically, literally. The bond pulsed in rhythm with hers, faint but steady, like a second drum beneath her skin. She thought of the attic, the altar, the photograph. She thought of Ophelia, of the house burning behind them, of the mirror and the diary and the frost-covered word on the window pane. Offering, she whispered. Lucille joined her as the stars rose. Neither spoke. They understood now. The knife wasn't the only choice. The real decision was what kind of legacy they would leave behind. Fear or defiance, obedience or rebellion, curse or memory. And as they sat in the darkness, twin silhouettes against the cold firelight, something in the trees stirred, not with threat, but anticipation. They hadn't chosen death. They had chosen not to choose at all, and in doing so, they'd changed the shape of the bond. But the bond, like all living things, would not go quietly. It would demand its own answer. Soon. The knife remained where it had fallen, untouched for days, but its presence lingered like a whisper no one could forget. Elias watched the sisters with a quiet intensity, neither urging them forward nor offering relief. He knew the rhythm of these things. Rituals did not obey clocks, they obeyed will. Clara dreamed of fire again. Not the house, not the town, but a fire that burned without smoke, without warmth. In it stood a figure cloaked in ash, faceless, arms open. Behind the figure, a mirror, always the mirror. When she woke, she knew. There's a way, she told Lucille. It's in the journal, hidden between lines. We missed it. Together they pored over the pages again. Diagrams blurred by water stains, incantations scribbled in margins, names long forgotten. But there, beneath a sketch of the old altar, Clara found it. A passage written in Everly code, half phonetic, half symbolic. To seal the bond is to own it, not to sever, not to submit, but to name and bind, one knife, one spell, one choice made together. Lucille stared at the words. You think it means we don't kill each other, we bind it, make it ours? Elias said nothing when they brought him the passage. He only nodded slowly and pulled another book from his shelf. This one older than the others, bound in human leather, the pages yellow as rot. You'll need 3 things, he said, his blood, consent, reflection. He handed them chalk and dried herbs, candles, and the blade. Then he drew the binding circle in the grove, 12 feet wide, interlaced with symbols that made Lucille's skin crawl just to look at. In the center, 2 places were marked. Both must stand inside, Elias said. Both must speak the words. If either heart doubts, the ritual fractures. The sisters entered the circle. The wind died. The trees held their breath. Clara took the knife. She cut her palm slowly, carefully. Blood dripped into the soil. Lucille followed, flinching only slightly. They clasped hands, fingers slipping through blood and ash. Elias lit the candles. One by one, a ring of flame encircled them. Lucille began the incantation. The words felt wrong on her tongue, but necessary. Clara followed, matching her tone, her rhythm. The air shimmered. The ground beneath them vibrated. The symbols began to glow, not with heat, but with memory. Then, glass shattered, not in the grove, in their minds. A sound, like a mirror, breaking. Lucille gasped. Her knees buckled. Clara screamed. Their bodies remained standing, but their minds twisted sideways, pulled into a place that felt like no place. They stood now in a reflection, not a grove, but a room. Familiar? Circular, wood and stone and dust. The mirror room, the one from the West Wing. Before them stood their reflections, twisted slightly, not evil, not other, just wrong. The reflections moved first. Clara's mirror self smiled, wide and sharp. Lucille's eyes turned black. The bond pulsed. Clara reached forward. Her hand passed through the glass. The reflection stepped back. Lucille hesitated. Behind the mirror figures a third form rose, a shadow coiled in the shape of a woman. No face, only long grey hair and outstretched arms. Ophelia? No, older. The voice came not as sound, but as pressure. Bind and belong, or break and bleed. Lucille looked to Clara. "We do this together," she whispered. Clara nodded. They spoke the final word. The light exploded. They woke in the grove, breathless. The knife was gone. The blood on their hands had dried to gold. The circle was still burning, but now the flame ran inward, not out. Elias knelt, eyes wide. "You did it." The bond remained, but different, not pain, not weight, a current. For the first time in their lives, the Everly sisters were not bound by suffering, but by will. And something deep in the woods howled in recognition. After the ritual, the forest changed. The trees no longer whispered. They watched. The birds flew in circles and never landed. Roots twisted across paths that hadn't been there the day before. Even Elias, who had lived in the woods for half his life, no longer walked without lanterns, no longer stepped without salt in his pocket. But it wasn't the forest that had changed. It was Everly Hollow. Clara felt it first, like a tremor beneath her ribs, a pulse in the dirt. Lucille heard it at night, soft chants echoing far below ground, not voices but intentions, pressing upward like fingers beneath floorboards. Whatever had been sealed was stirring. One morning, Elias stood outside the cabin and turned his face toward the wind. He said nothing for a long time. Then, "The hollow's waking, and it remembers you." The sisters looked at each other. The bond between them was still active, still real, but now it was filled with new things, images neither had seen, thoughts that weren't theirs, dreams that bled into waking. They spoke in unison sometimes without meaning to. They slept without knowing who was dreaming. And something beneath the soil had taken notice. The night it rose began quietly. The fire in the cabin flickered low. Lucille sat by the window, watching fog slide between the trees like spilled milk. Clara lay on the floor, eyes wide, seeing shapes in the ceiling she didn't understand. Then the forest exhaled. Every tree bent forward in unison, their branches pointing inward. The earth shifted, moaned. From beneath the roots a sound grew, first like thunder, then like breathing, then like thousands of voices layered into one, low, feminine, unrelenting. "We see." The ground split behind the cabin. A chasm opened where none had been, and from its depths rose something not entirely formed, a structure built of earth and bone and memory. A mound, or perhaps a rib cage. In its center, a hollow mouth yawning open toward the sky. Lucille staggered outside. Elias shouted after her, but she didn't stop. She was drawn. Clara followed, but slower, her feet heavy as if the dirt itself tried to hold her. Lucille approached the structure and heard her name, not spoken but woven into the wind. Inside her mind something answered. Clara reached her side just as the mound pulsed. A blinding light erupted from the opening. They both collapsed. When they woke, morning had not come. It would not come. The sun had vanished. The sky above was locked in dusk, pale and grey, stretched thin like skin over bone. Elias was gone. The cabin had decayed overnight, roof sunken, books scattered and soaked through. The standing stones had crumbled, their carvings erased, and Clara could feel something moving beneath her skin. It wasn't pain, it was memory. She began to remember things she'd never lived, walking through halls she'd never seen, standing in the attic, not as a child but older, with candles burning in every corner and the altar lit with flame. She remembered names, incantations. She remembered being watched. Lucille, too, began to speak in tongues when she slept, old words, forgotten ones. Once Clara awoke to find symbols drawn on the walls in blood. Neither remembered doing it. The hollow had awakened, but not just to stir. It had come to merge. The boundary between girl and shadow, between thought and echo, was thinning. The Everly sisters were no longer just heirs to a bond. They were vessels for something waiting centuries to return, and the return had begun. Their choices were behind them. The hollow would decide what came next. They no longer slept. Not truly. When their eyes closed, they slipped not into rest, but into a space between worlds, half memory, half echo. A place of shifting walls and flickering lights, where every voice was familiar, and every thought wore someone else's face. Clara could no longer tell which thoughts were hers. Lucille sometimes spoke with her mouth closed, words leaking from her in dreams she didn't remember. They would sit beside each other for hours in silence, yet hold entire conversations without speaking a word. The bond had deepened into something neither had expected, possession maybe, or merging or unraveling. Clara looked in the mirror and saw not one face, but two layered atop each other. Her reflection blinked before she did. Her smile was half hers, half someone else's. Lucille found herself writing in languages she didn't know, hands moving on their own, tracing symbols in soot, in blood, in air. The house, or what remained of it, echoed with new life. The wind carried voices that mimicked theirs. The forest pulsed with footsteps that never left prints. Something ancient had nested in their minds, and it wasn't leaving. One evening, Clara screamed, not from pain, but from silence. She'd sat for hours staring into the fireplace, and then, gone. No thought, no memory. When she returned, Lucille stood over her, mouth open in horror, a handprint burned into her shoulder. "I wasn't here," Clara whispered. "I was... her." Lucille said nothing. She didn't have to. They'd both felt it. There was a third voice now, not loud, not constant, but present. It spoke in fragments, repetitions, always the same phrases. Mirror, memory, mother, complete. It didn't sound angry. Or kind, just inevitable. Lucille began to forget small things, her own handwriting, the names of childhood books, the smell of lavender soap their mother once used. Clara, too, lost time, whole hours dissolved. Once she woke in the grove, dirt under her nails, her lips sore from chanting. But the worst part wasn't the forgetting, it was the remembering things that weren't theirs. They began sharing memories they'd never lived. Lucille knew the taste of wine from a wedding in 1864. Clara recalled the feel of wool gloves stitched in 1781. They dreamed of births, of deaths, of altars and drownings, and hands held too tightly in firelight. The bond was opening something vast. It was no longer a bridge between two souls. It was a doorway, and something was walking through. They tried to fight it. Salt circles, burned herbs, Elias's protective runes redrawn again and again. But nothing stopped the pressure. It grew daily, like something pushing through a crack in the skin, widening it. Then, one morning, they awoke to find the trees had moved. The forest's shape was different. Paths once known now led nowhere. The grove had sunk into the earth. The chasm had closed. And the mirror stood in its place. Not broken, not aged, new, clean. It reflected not their faces, but the attic altar, not the present, but the moment of the failed offering. 2 girls, 2 candles, 1 choice not made. Clara fell to her knees. Lucille touched the glass. They both gasped. For an instant, brief, blinding, they were no longer themselves. They were her, she of the whispers. She of the bond's origin, not Iphigenia, not Ophelia. Older, rooted in blood and ritual and inheritance. The voice that had never been born, but always been present. And in that moment, it made itself clear. They were not meant to share the bond. They were meant to be the vessel for it. Not 2, 1. And now the bond demanded it. They stopped speaking the next morning. Words had become unreliable, betrayed by echoes and memories not their own. Each sentence seemed to bend, ripple, twist in the air, as though someone else was listening. Someone else was answering. So they sat in silence. The mirror remained in the clearing, untouched. It didn't age. It didn't fog. It reflected only what it chose to show. And lately it showed not Clara and Lucille, but only one face. Merged, undistinguished, whole. They understood now what the voice had meant. The bond could no longer hold 2. Clara stood first. Her hand trembled as she reached for Lucille's. They looked at each other, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in acceptance. There was no more ritual, no more blade, no more spell. The offering wasn't something to be performed. It was something to be given. Lucille shook her head just once. "No," she mouthed. Clara smiled, faint and slow. "Yes." She walked to the mirror barefoot, blood from an old wound darkening the grass. The air around it shimmered, like heat off stone. The mirror's surface rippled. Lucille stepped forward. She wanted to stop her, but something inside her pulsed, deep and resonant. It was not grief. It was recognition. She knew in that moment she could not follow. Not this time. Clara raised her hand. The mirror opened. It did not break, did not shatter. It folded inward. Lucille tried to cry out, but no sound came. Her voice caught in her chest like a trapped bird. Clara looked back one final time. Her lips moved. "Thank you." And then she stepped through. The air closed behind her with no sound. Lucille collapsed. Her hands hit the ground. The grass beneath her was warm, not from the sun, but from presence. Her chest ached. Her bones hummed. The bond shifted, not severed, not broken, but concentrated. Clara was gone, but not lost. She was inside. And now Lucille bore both their lives. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was complete. The birds did not sing. The trees did not sway. The wind itself fell still. Lucille remained on the ground until dusk, unmoving, empty, and overfull at once. Her thoughts came layered, hers, Clara's, and something deeper. The voice had not left. It had changed. Now it lived inside her. Not whispering, not guiding, but waiting. Waiting for what she did not know. She returned to the ruined cabin alone. The forest let her pass. She found the journal by the hearth, open to a blank page. Her hand moved before she thought, writing in ink she did not remember dipping, letters she did not recognize forming symbols older than speech. When she finished, she read it aloud. One sentence. "Silence is not the absence of sound, but the fullness of memory." And she understood. The offering had not been about death. It had been about containment. Clara's body was gone, but her essence lived, folded into Lucille like breath into lungs. The bond had not ended. It had matured, past its final threshold. Now, Lucille carried not pain, not agony, but a legacy, the weight of blood and echo. And in the dark places of the forest, something ancient went still. Not defeated, but satisfied. The vessel had been accepted. The mind, once torn, was now singular, complete, silent. She would not scream again, because she no longer had to. The town forgot, or pretended to. The fire had erased the mansion, the mother, the story. No one came looking for Clara. No one asked what had become of the girls. Everly Hollow closed its eyes, grateful for the silence. But Lucille returned, not with fanfare, not with warning. One fog-heavy morning in 1903, a figure appeared at the edge of the woods, walking slowly down the broken path that once led to the Everley estate. She was dressed in black, her eyes blacker still. No one approached. No one needed to. They knew who she was. She said nothing. She purchased the last standing cottage at the edge of town, a crooked little place with moss on the roof and a stone fence half buried in the ground. She boarded its windows and painted the door red. And there she stayed. For decades. Children grew up hearing her name whispered like a warning. Don't go past the gate, she'll steal your voice. If you see her in the window, run, you'll scream forever. But no one ever truly saw her, only glimpses, a shadow behind the glass, a flicker of motion when no one was near. Some nights, the lights inside would flicker for hours, though no oil or electricity was ever delivered. And every so often, the wind would carry a sound like humming. A tune no one knew but somehow feared. The townspeople called her the widow. No one knew if she ate. No one saw her shop. She existed like a story too old to end, tolerated, unspoken, necessary, and Lucille let them think what they would. She didn't age. Or if she did, it happened slowly, subtly. Her hair stayed dark for decades, her skin pale, unlined. Some swore she must be 50 by the time she was 30. Others thought she was dead already, and what walked behind the red door was not her at all. But she remained, watching, waiting. The years passed like smoke. By 1940, the town had changed. New roads, new faces, a few radios behind curtained windows. But the Everley cottage stayed the same. Red door unchipped, garden unplanted, windows blind to the world. Lucille kept to herself. But inside the house, time did not pass. Inside, the air remained thick with rosemary and ash. The diary rested unopened on the mantel. The mirror, covered always with black velvet, stood in the parlor like a wound sealed tight. Lucille no longer heard Clara's voice. But she felt her still, in the stillness, in the cold that lingered even in summer. She would sometimes wake with the weight of another breath in her lungs, or sit by the fire and feel laughter press against her throat, though no smile came. She didn't speak. Not once. Not since the offering. Silence had become her inheritance, and silence was what kept the hollow asleep. But she knew it was not gone, only waiting. And when she looked into the fire, those same flames that once licked the rafters of their home, she saw things, not memories, not ghosts, possibilities. A girl in a yellow dress touching the mirror, a scream not yet uttered, a crack forming in the bond she had sworn to seal. She wrote nothing down. She warned no one. Some nights the children of Everley Hollow claimed to see a figure standing by the stone fence, watching the town with eyes that shimmered. Those who stayed out too late said they heard a whisper, not cruel exactly, but hungry. Lucille waited, because the bond had not ended. It had quieted. But quiet is not the same as peace. And some silences are merely the breath drawn before the scream. In the summer of 1957, a tourist came to Everley Hollow. Her name was Margaret Calloway, 19 years old, curious, bright, drawn to ruins and folklore. She had read about the town in a travel pamphlet that barely mentioned it, a dot on the map with no attractions, no welcome center, no reason to visit, which is exactly why she came. She wandered the empty roads with a notebook in her satchel and a camera slung over her shoulder. Locals offered tight smiles but little else. One grocer warned her not to wander too far past the church. "Place stays quiet for a reason," he said. "Best you leave it that way." But Margaret didn't believe in superstition. On the second evening, she found the red door. It was set back from the road, half hidden behind ivy and low stone. The fence had nearly crumbled. No lights inside, no sign of life. But something about it called to her, a pull, soft and firm, like a rope drawn tight around the chest. She stepped inside without knocking. The air was cold, still. Dust floated like slow snow in shafts of dusk light. The house smelled of burnt herbs and old paper. Margaret wandered room to room. Nothing moved, no furniture out of place. The floorboards creaked, but not as if in protest, more like recognition. In the parlor she found the mirror, tall, black-framed, draped in velvet. Her fingers hesitated over the cloth, then pulled. For a moment, nothing. Just her own reflection, wide-eyed, cautious. Then the surface rippled. And behind her appeared a second shape, a woman not visible in the room but there in the glass. Tall, still, watching. Margaret turned, no one behind her. She looked again. The woman in the mirror moved forward. Margaret did not. She tried to breathe. She couldn't. Her knees buckled. From the hills of Everly Hollow, a sound rose like thunder cracking open the earth. A scream so piercing it silenced every bird in flight, shattered glass 3 houses away, and sent dogs into fits that lasted until dawn. Some said they felt it in their teeth. Others said they heard it in their dreams for weeks afterward. By the time anyone reached the red cottage, the door was gone. Not open. Not broken, gone. Vanished clean from the frame as if it had never been there at all. The mirror remained, no sign of the girl. But every so often, if one stood before it long enough, they claimed to see her. Just a flicker. A figure behind the glass, mouth wide, eyes locked in horror, reaching. No one stayed long. The house has remained untouched since. A story too strange for newspapers. Too quiet for authorities, but the town remembers. And still the rule remains, never speak the name Everly after dark. Because Lucille never left. Her body, maybe. Her voice, certainly. But something stayed in that house, something that had waited for decades, and found a way back. Some nights, if the wind shifts just right, you can still hear it. A cry not quite human, not quite memory. A sound that doesn't fade, a final scream. Carried across generations, born from a bond that should never have existed, carried by girls who never had a choice. And now, before this story ends, take a breath and remember. Silence is never just silence. Not here, not in Everly Hollow. If you made it this far, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that linger long after the last word. And if you dare, click the video on screen now to uncover the next dark tale waiting just beyond the mirror.